The first distress call was ignored. So was the second. By the time the third one rang out through the galactic relay, it was already old news. The Veithari were done for, everyone knew it. Their world, HFY, was crumbling. Their feeble attempts at terraforming had failed, their resources were stretched thin, and worse still, their bureaucratic leadership refused to accept outside intervention. Arrogance? Pride? Maybe. But in the cold, ruthless theater of galactic geopolitics, sympathy was a scarce commodity, and the Veithari had none to spare. The Galactic Concord, a coalition of the most powerful interstellar species, had quietly struck them off their priority list. If a species was too weak to fend for itself, then it had no place in the future of the galaxy. Efficiency dictated survival, and the Veithari were neither efficient nor adaptable. They had sealed their own fate. Or so everyone thought. Commander Elias Drake wasn't everyone. When the distress call reached him aboard the UHS Resolute, his first reaction wasn't apathy, it was frustration. Frustration at the bureaucracy. Frustration at the cold pragmatism of the Concord. Frustration at the way the universe was so quick to discard the helpless. Drake sat in the dim glow of the command deck, his cybernetic hand tapping against the console in agitation. The blue-hued hologram of Captain Lyra Varesh flickered before him, an Ulnari officer who, unlike most of her kind, didn't look down on humans. "Elias, this isn't our fight," she said, her smooth, melodic voice laced with exasperation. "I know. Then why do you look like you're about to do something incredibly stupid?" "Because someone has to." Varesh sighed, rubbing her temple. "You realize the Veithari don't even like humans, right? They've been arrogant isolationists for centuries. They'd sooner spit on your boots than thank you." "Maybe," Drake admitted, glancing at the data feed. "But last I checked, we don't pick our battles based on gratitude. We pick them based on whether they're right." Varesh's mandibles clicked in irritation, but she didn't argue. Instead, she just folded her arms. "You realize you'll be alone in this?" Drake smirked. "Wouldn't be the first time." A few hours later, the Resolute exited slipspace above HFY. It was worse than Drake had expected. The planet's surface was a mosaic of devastation. The atmosphere was failing, massive storms sweeping across barren landscapes where lush forests once stood. The orbital platforms were crippled, hollowed-out relics of what had once been a thriving civilization. And the people? The Veithari weren't warriors. They weren't explorers. They were artists, thinkers, and poets. A culture built on philosophy and beauty, not war and industry. Which meant they had no defenses when everything started collapsing. Drake had seen many things in his years: wars, massacres, entire planets burned to cinders. But there was something uniquely haunting about the silent ruin of a civilization that had simply given up. And yet, they weren't dead. Not yet. A transmission crackled over the comms. "Weak. Desperate. Unidentified vessel, state your intentions." Drake leaned forward. "UHS Resolute, Commander Elias Drake. I'm here to help." Silence. Then, a ragged voice, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "A human." Drake fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Listen, I don't have time for politics. I've got supplies, engineers, and a hell of a lot more spine than whatever bureaucrats left you to rot. So either you tell me where to land, or I start guessing." Another pause. Then, reluctantly, "Docking Bay 4, but do not expect gratitude." Drake grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it." The landing wasn't smooth. The atmosphere was unstable, and the docking bay was half-collapsed, barely functional. As the ship's landing gear screeched against the platform, Drake braced himself for the kind of welcome only a desperate and bitter species could provide. He wasn't disappointed. The Veithari delegation was small, their once pristine robes now tattered, their expressions gaunt. At their head stood High Minister Kesh Vila, hollow-eyed and visibly malnourished, but still clinging to a shred of defiant dignity. "You should not have come," Vila said flatly. "You're welcome," Drake shot back, stepping forward. Vila's silver eyes narrowed. "You do not understand. Your presence will complicate matters with the Concord. We have already been deemed unworthy. Drake's expression darkened. Then maybe the Concord can go to hell. Gasps rippled through the Veithari. Even Vila seemed momentarily taken aback by the sheer audacity of the statement. You do not comprehend the consequences of interfering in matters beyond your... Drake cut him off. I comprehend just fine. You're starving. You're losing air. Your planet's turning into a tomb, and the only thing standing between you and extinction is whatever pride you've got left. Newsflash, Minister, pride isn't edible. The tension was palpable. The Veithari were not used to bluntness. Their culture was built on elaborate diplomacy, on words that danced around meaning rather than confronting it head-on. Vila exhaled slowly. You humans are insufferable. Drake grinned. We're also alive. That shut him up. After a tense silence, Vila turned sharply. Follow me. The deeper they went into the Veithari stronghold, the clearer the desperation became. Starving civilians huddled in corners. Medical bays overflowing. Engineers working frantically to repair failing infrastructure. Drake took it all in with a grim expression. This wasn't just a disaster. This was a death sentence. What happened here? He asked. Vila hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. We built our civilization on the assumption that we would always have control. That our way of life was untouchable. We devoted ourselves to art, to thought, to refinement, and neglected the fundamental truth of survival. When our terraforming failed, when the resources dwindled, we had no contingency. The Concord refused aid, deeming us non-viable. And now, we are ghosts in our own halls. Drake shook his head. No. Not yet. Vila studied him warily. What exactly do you think you can do, human? Drake cracked his knuckles. I think I can remind the universe why it should never count us out. And just like that, the first domino fell. He put his crew to work immediately. Supplies were offloaded. Engineers assessed damage. And, most importantly, Drake made sure the Veithari saw it firsthand, saw the sheer, relentless determination that humanity embodied. No red tape. No hesitation. Just action. But he knew it wouldn't be that easy. Because somewhere out there, watching, was the Concord. And they weren't going to like this. Not one bit. The first week was chaos. Drake had seen desperate people before, but nothing like this. The Veithari weren't just suffering, they were breaking. Their society, so rigid in its traditions, was collapsing under the weight of its own inaction. They weren't used to fighting for survival. They weren't used to clawing their way out of despair. So, naturally, Drake had to do it for them. This entire sector is structurally unsound, Lieutenant Callahan muttered, scrolling through a datapad as he and Drake surveyed the remnants of the Veithari food production district. The hydroponic towers are dead. Power's failing across multiple zones. And their filtration systems? Don't even get me started. Drake sighed. So what you're saying is, we're completely screwed. Callahan grinned. Oh, absolutely. But I figured you'd want to hear it in technical terms first. Drake shook his head, rubbing his temples. Great. Fantastic. Love the optimism. All right, what do we have? Callahan's expression sobered. We've got enough rations to keep them going for maybe a month. Maybe. But if we don't find a way to get their infrastructure stabilized, we're just delaying the inevitable. Drake glanced at Vila, who had been silently observing the exchange with that same unreadable expression. All right, Minister, level with me. What's the worst-case scenario here? Vila hesitated, then exhaled. If the atmospheric deterioration continues, we will not survive another cycle. Our oxygen processes are failing. If they collapse entirely, our people will suffocate before starvation even becomes an issue. Callahan muttered a curse under his breath. So it's worse than I thought. Fantastic. Drake ran a hand down his face. Okay. All right. We can fix this. We will fix this. Vila arched a skeptical brow. And how, exactly, do you intend to do that? Your ship, while impressive, does not have the resources to single-handedly reverse an ecological collapse. Drake smirked. No, but I've got something better. Vila frowned. And that is, Drake's grin widened. An absolutely reckless disregard for authority. And just like that, the real plan began. The first step was breaking the blockade. Technically, there wasn't an official blockade around Arcata 4. That would have been too overt. No, the Concord was smarter than that. Instead of deploying warships, they had simply spread the word, Arcata 4 was a lost cause. No trade, no aid, no outside assistance. Any ship found ferrying supplies to the Veithari would be discouraged. Which, in Concord terms, meant shot out of the sky. That meant Drake couldn't rely on traditional supply lines. He needed smugglers. Scoundrels. The kind of people who didn't give a damn about galactic politics and really didn't like being told what to do. Luckily, he knew just where to find them. The plan was simple: take a shuttle, head to the nearest independent station, and convince a bunch of criminals that saving an entire species was worth the risk. In theory, it should have been impossible. In practice, it was just another Tuesday. The moment Drake set foot in the smoky, neon-lit den of vice known as the Crimson Spire, he felt right at home. The place stank of sweat, alcohol, and questionable life choices. Perfect. He strolled through the crowds, eyes scanning for a familiar face. He found one at the far end of the bar, a woman with dark, cybernetic implants lining her arms and a permanent smirk that practically radiated bad decisions. "Drake," she drawled, swirling a drink in one hand. "Didn't think I'd see you here. Thought you finally got yourself killed. Nice to see you too, Ren." Ren Carlos was a smuggler, a thief, and possibly the best pilot in 3 systems. She was also completely untrustworthy. Perfect for the job. "I need a favor," Drake said, sliding into the seat across from her. Ren snorted. "Oh, this is gonna be good." He leaned in. "Arcata 4. Her smirk disappeared. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "Drake, you realize what you're asking, right? The Concord's got that place locked down tighter than a vault. Any ship that tries to smuggle supplies past their patrols? Dead." Drake grinned. "That's why I need you." Ren rubbed her temples. "You are such a pain in the ass. And yet, here we are." She groaned. "Fine. But this is gonna cost you." Drake's grin widened. "Oh, don't worry. I've got something better than credits." Ren arched a brow. "Oh." Drake leaned in. "Bragging rights?" She stared at him. "You are the worst." "Is that a yes?" She sighed. "Yeah, it's a yes." The blockade run was a nightmare. Ren and her crew had to navigate through shifting patrol routes, blindside sensors, and outmaneuver Concord gunships that really didn't appreciate unregistered freighters slipping through their net. But in the end, they made it. The first shipment landed on Arcata 4 3 days later. And suddenly, everything changed. For the first time in weeks, the Veithari had fresh supplies. Medical aid. Critical components for their oxygen processes. It wasn't a full solution, but it was hope. And hope was dangerous. Because the moment the Concord got wind of what was happening, they reacted exactly as Drake expected them to. They sent warships. Vila stared at the incoming fleet, his expression unreadable. "You have doomed us." Drake crossed his arms. "No, I've forced their hand." Vila's silver eyes burned with frustration. "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly," Drake interrupted. "They were going to let you die in the dark. Quietly. Neatly. No scandal. No resistance. But now? Now they have to justify it." Vila hesitated. Drake jabbed a finger at the view screen. "This isn't just about Arcata 4 anymore. The whole damn galaxy is watching. They either help you, or they admit, publicly, that they are willing to let an entire civilization die just because it's inconvenient." Vila's expression shifted. Not quite acceptance. Not quite understanding. But something close. And then the first warning shot rang out across the void. The battle for Arcata 4 had begun. The first shot was a warning. The second wasn't. A streak of red plasma ripped through the sky, shattering the upper atmosphere as the Resolute's shields flared bright against the impact. The Veithari, who had spent their entire lives insulated from war, flinched at the sight of battle arriving at their doorstep. Drake? Drake grinned. Callahan, what's the situation? He barked, gripping the railing as another impact rocked the ship. The lieutenant's voice crackled over comms, tense but controlled. Concord fleet just entered low orbit. 3 battleships, 5 cruisers, a whole lot of pissed-off gunships. They are not playing around, Commander. Drake nodded. Good. Neither are we. Vila whirled on him, silver eyes blazing. You find this amusing? Drake didn't look away from the viewport. I find it predictable. Vila seethed. You have forced a confrontation we cannot win. Drake turned sharply, stepping in close. No, I forced a confrontation we can't afford to lose. There's a difference. Vila exhaled sharply, frustration warring with desperation. What do you intend to do, human? You cannot fight a Concord fleet alone. Drake smirked. Who said anything about fighting alone? At that moment, the sensors flared. New signatures. Dozens. Wren's fleet had arrived. It wasn't much: ragtag freighters, repurposed cargo haulers, and a few heavily modified gunships, but they were fast, unpredictable, and most importantly, they had nothing to lose. Wren's voice crackled over the comms, smug as ever. You weren't thinking of starting this party without me, were you? Drake chuckled. Wouldn't dream of it. Vila looked between them, disbelief etched across his face. You trust criminals and outlaws to fight for you. Drake shot him a look. They are not fighting for me. They are fighting because they hate the Concord more than they love money. Turns out, nobody likes a bully. Vila hesitated, but before he could respond, the comms flared again. This time, it wasn't Wren. It was the Concord. A cold, measured voice filled the bridge. This is Admiral Tovan of the Galactic Concord. UHS Resolute, you are in direct violation of interstellar law. Cease your interference immediately and withdraw, or you will be neutralized. Drake smirked. See, the funny thing about threats, Admiral, is that they only work when the other guy is scared. A pause. Then, so be it. And with that, the battle truly began. The first wave was brutal. The Concord didn't bother with posturing. Within seconds, their cruisers unleashed a relentless barrage of plasma fire, forcing Wren's fleet to scatter. The Resolute took the brunt of the assault, its reinforced shields flaring with every impact. Drake didn't flinch. Callahan, talk to me. Shields holding at 60%. Our dorsal railguns are firing, but they barely scratch their armor. Then stop aiming for armor. Callahan blinked, then grinned. Oh, I like where this is going. Drake slammed his fist against the intercom. Gunners, target their sensor arrays. I want those ships flying blind. The Resolute shifted, its heavy cannons swiveling mid-battle. Instead of hammering at the Concord's thick hull plating, they unleashed precision fire at the vulnerable sensor domes. Within moments, 2 enemy cruisers reeled as their targeting systems flickered and died. Ha! That got their attention. Callahan whooped. Drake grinned. Now let's make it count. Meanwhile, on the surface, things weren't much better. The Veithari stronghold shook as Concord drop pods rained down from orbit, unleashing squads of heavily armored soldiers. The Veithari panicked. They weren't warriors. They weren't ready. But the humans were. Drake's security teams, alongside a few of Wren's rougher mercenaries, took position in the crumbling streets. Plasma fire filled the air as they clashed with Concord enforcers, turning the once pristine halls of the Veithari into a battlefield. Vila watched in horror as the conflict unfolded. His people, unarmed, untrained, scrambled for safety as human soldiers fought to defend them. A Veithari scholar, wide-eyed and trembling, turned to him. What do we do? Vila clenched his fists. For centuries, his people had relied on diplomacy, on careful words and measured actions. But words would not stop the slaughter. For the first time in his life, Vila made a choice. He grabbed a fallen Concord weapon, turned to the scholar, and said, "We fight." In orbit, things were getting worse. Wren's fleet was nimble, but they were outgunned. The Concord's battleships moved methodically, cutting off escape routes and pushing them into a kill zone. Drake saw it happening, and he knew what had to be done. "Callahan, bring us in close." Callahan's eyes widened. "Close? To a battleship?" Drake smirked. "Trust me." Reluctantly, Callahan obeyed. The Resolute surged forward, weaving through the chaos and drawing fire as it approached the lead Concord vessel. Tovin's voice rang through comms again. "You are making a mistake, Drake." Drake grinned. "Wouldn't be my first." Then, at the last second, he issued the command. "Fire the disruptors." Now. A pulse of energy erupted from the Resolute, a concentrated electromagnetic burst aimed directly at the battleship's engines. The effect was immediate. The massive vessel shuddered as its systems flickered and failed. For the first time in the battle, the Concord hesitated. And that was all they needed. Ren's fleet seized the opportunity, diving in to exploit the opening. Explosions rippled through the enemy ranks as smugglers, mercenaries, and outlaws turned the tide. Drake leaned forward, voice steady. "Admiral, you can keep fighting. Or you can retreat and pretend this never happened." Silence. Then, finally, Tovin spoke. "Damn you, human." And just like that, the Concord fleet withdrew. The battle was won. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. Drake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. That was too easy. Vila, still clutching his stolen weapon, turned to him. "Easy." Drake nodded grimly. "They'll be back. And next time, they won't hold back." Vila's gaze hardened. "Then we must be ready." Drake grinned. "Now you're getting it." The Veithari weren't just victims anymore. They were survivors. And for the first time in history, they were human enough to fight. The aftermath of the battle was worse than the battle itself. HFY still teetered on the brink of collapse. The Veithari's atmosphere remained unstable, their resources critically low. The Concord had retreated, but they hadn't lost, only regrouped. And everyone knew they'd return, with more ships, more firepower, and an official mandate to eradicate the so-called rebellion. Drake stood atop a fractured balcony, surveying the broken city below. Smoke curled from ruined buildings, and the distant hum of emergency sirens filled the air. His crew worked tirelessly, distributing what little supplies they had left, reinforcing defenses, trying to hold together a world that had already been written off as dead. Beside him, Vila leaned against the crumbling railing, silver eyes locked on the horizon. "You were right," the Veithari leader admitted quietly. "The Concord was never going to save us. They were only waiting for us to die." Drake exhaled, folding his arms. "That's the thing about bureaucracies, Vila. They never get their hands dirty. They just let people like us do the dying for them." Vila turned to him. "And yet, you came. Even knowing it would make you their enemy." Drake smirked. "I've been an enemy of the Concord since the day I was born." Vila hesitated. "Then what do we do now?" Drake looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something different in the Veithari leader's eyes. Not defeat. Not resignation. Something sharper. Something human. "We fight," Drake said simply. Vila exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then we will need more than desperation. We will need an army." Drake grinned. "Lucky for you, I know just the kind of people who love a good fight." It started as a whisper. The Veithari had always been seen as weak, as hopeless. But now, stories spread. Stories of a single human warship standing against the might of the Concord. Of smugglers and mercenaries throwing themselves into a battle not for profit, but for principle. Of a dying race refusing to go quietly. And across the stars, people listened. Ren's smugglers returned, but this time, they weren't alone. Independent warbands, rogue captains, and disillusioned soldiers, those who had long despised the Concord's cold efficiency, flocked to HFY. They weren't heroes. They weren't saints. They were outcasts and criminals, rebels and exiles. But they were human. And they were ready to fight. The Concord came back 2 weeks later. They didn't send 3 battleships this time. They sent a fleet. A real fleet. Dozens of warships, blockade runners, and planetary assault teams. A force designed to wipe out a civilization in a single strike. Drake stood on the war room deck, arms crossed, as the enemy signatures blinked red on the holomap. Callahan whistled. Well, that's a lot of pissed-off bureaucrats. Drake nodded. Good. Vila studied the display with grim determination. Even with your reinforcements, we are outmatched. Drake smirked. That's why we don't fight fair. The battle for Arquetta wasn't won through brute force. It was won through chaos. The moment the Concord fleet entered high orbit, they were hit with the first surprise. Veithari engineers, guided by human ingenuity, had sabotaged their own orbital platforms, turning them into kinetic weapons. Massive structures, rigged with stolen Concord engines, slammed into the enemy formation like meteors, shattering the first wave before they could even deploy. Then came the second surprise. Wren's smugglers, using hacked Concord transponders, infiltrated their supply lines. The fleet's ammunition caches vanished. Weapons malfunctioned mid-firing. Entire ships found themselves suddenly out of fuel as their reserves were siphoned away. By the time the real fighting began, the Concord's overwhelming advantage had been shattered. Drake led the charge himself. The Resolute weaved through the battlefield, cutting through enemy formations with precision strikes. The Veithari, once too afraid to pick up a weapon, now fought with terrifying resolve. And Vila? Vila led them. No longer a politician, no longer a scholar, he was something else now. A warrior, shaped in the crucible of necessity. Together, they did the impossible. They didn't just resist the Concord. They broke them. Admiral Tovin's flagship fell lost. The moment it detonated in a fiery bloom, the Concord fleet collapsed. They ran. For the first time in history, the Galactic Concord, unquestioned rulers of interstellar politics, had been defeated. By humans. By Veithari. By the unwanted and the discarded. Days later, as the fires of war faded, Drake stood atop the same ruined balcony, looking out at a planet that had defied extinction. Vila approached him, his robes tattered but his eyes bright. You have changed us, he said simply. Drake smirked. Nah. You just needed someone to remind you that dying quietly isn't the only option. Vila chuckled. Perhaps. He turned, looking at the horizon. The Concord will not forget this. They will return. With more ships. More laws. More force. Drake nodded. And when they do, Vila's silver eyes burned with a new kind of fire. Then they will learn, he said, that we are not helpless anymore. Drake grinned. Damn right. And with that, the legend of Arquetta was born. The legend of a species that had refused to die. The legend of a human who had dared to defy an empire. And the legend of a war that was just beginning.